And we're live. How's everybody doing tonight?
Good. How are you, Brett?
I'm doing all right. It's been a stressful week, but here I am. Ready to talk about some recovery. Ready to talk to our new friend, Mary Beth. Excited to be here.
This is going to be a good one. I'm excited about this week. It's going to be a different perspective. Do you want to jump in? Go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself, Mary Beth.
Sure. And of course, thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to your audience and tell a little bit about me and, sort of some of the issues or concepts that I advocate about. So I say my story in brief is really that child abuse led to childhood addiction. My mother really wasn't bonded or connected to me, which was problematic. And she sometimes would be violent, but the real big problem arose when she married my stepfather when I was 9, and he was really abusive to all of us. He was physically abusive to her. He was verbally, emotionally, physically, and sexually abusive to me. And so living in the house where I never really knew what was going to happen and where I didn't have control over the situation, and it created a lot of stress. So for me, drugs looked like a good idea. And I started using alcohol first when I was 12. And then I moved on to pot, then pills, then acid, until I found my drug of choice at 16, which was methamphetamine. And I started shooting meth at 17 and was in full bore addiction when I graduated from high school. So, it was not a great start to life. It was already problematic at a very young age. And I did manage to keep it a little bit better under control in college. I moved from New Jersey to California. So the geographic switch helped a bit. I still used to excess at times, but I mostly kept it on the weekends. And I didn't use meth that much, which helped me stay a little bit more in control. But in college, I had a really life-threatening multi-assailant rape. And then I moved in with my abusive boyfriend in my senior year. And by January of my senior year, I could not hold it together anymore. And I turned back to my familiar relief, which was meth, and I started again. And I spent the next 10 years using meth on a regular basis, basically almost a daily basis. And I started shooting again about a year or two after I started up again. So that was, puts me at 32, right? I had worked my way down the corporate ladder because I couldn't hold a job. My body was breaking down. I was having a lot of problems, and I was really in a hopeless, miserable, depressed state at 32 years old.
That's a hard start.
Yeah, it wasn't a good start. I even say, things went bad before I even came out of the womb, because my mother was actually in 1961 an unwed teenage woman, and that in a Irish Catholic household, and that was a major problem. So the first 6 months of my life, I actually lived with the nuns. I didn't even live with my family. So even that little piece of unusual part of my story is trouble before I even, as I say, before I even came out of the womb, it was trouble.
And that's hard because there's so much that happens during that time, bonding, and it's just hard. It's, and I've learned recently about, infant trauma, and, we never knew that kind of stuff could affect people that early, just not bonding properly. So
that's right. I expect the nuns took physical care of me and, probably gave me some attention. But even my mother's own version of the story is that she came by, occasionally to visit me. And when I met my now husband, he told me that I reminded him of those monkeys who never got touched as babies, that was really the impression that he had for me. So I do think it had an impact, but it was also an impact because it was indicative of the lack of bonding from my mother to me in general. She just wasn't really focused on being a mother. It wasn't something that she was particularly interested in. And so all of that really set me up to feel alone. I actually had OCD-like tendencies when I was 4 or 5 years old. I remember them very specifically. So I was trying to soothe myself in whatever way I could. Even at that young age, I had sort of unusual behavior patterns in an effort to try to calm myself.
Yeah. It sounds like it was a rough start. And actually, your time frame is pretty close to what mine was, because I'm 37 and I've been in recovery for 5.5 years. So I was probably about 32. So when I found recovery, I'm about where you are in your story. So
yes, that's right. So you know how long it is if you picked up at an early age like I did in particular. I mean, I used for 20 years, and I really would say that I was, had a substance use disorder for at least 16 of those years, if not more. Because of course we never know what day we switch from someone who's just using to someone who actually has a problem. But I really pursued drugs from the beginning. I pursued alcohol right away. The first time that I drank with my girlfriend, it was fun and we were laughing and giggling, but I was immediately seeking alcohol out. I was trying to find ways to get it. Even at that young age, I was stealing beers from my stepfather. I was taking that risk. And every time I was going somewhere, I would be looking for older people who might have access to alcohol. And so even from the beginning, I was pursuing it. It wasn't casual. It was on my mind. I was planning, how can I get access to alcohol, whatever the next drug was, when, how, how am I going to find it? Who's going to have it? It was just a constant mind obsession from pretty much the first drink that I had.
well, what happened? You said at 32. Then
Yeah, so at 32, I go into rehab. I went into a women's program near me. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it was a long-term program. It was a 90-day minimum commitment, and I thought I needed that. I really destroyed my life. I was barely hanging on by my fingernails. I wouldn't even say I was hanging on. I wasn't hanging on anymore, and I hadn't been for a long time. So I thought a longer term program was a good idea. And I went there thinking, I'm going for medical treatment. They'll help me out. And when I got there, I was actually surprised because every day they would do a step study, as a lot of recovery houses do. And, they would read one of the steps, and then they would either read the big book text or the NA text about the step. And then we would have a conversation. And it so happened on my first day, they were doing step 3, made a decision to turn my will and my life over to the God of my understanding, I think is the terminology. And so during the discussion, I raised my hand and I said, what about me? I'm an atheist and I don't believe in God. And they did say it doesn't have to be God. It can be any higher power. And I said, but I don't believe in a higher power. And they really were adamant and vehemently insistent that there was one and only one way to recover. And that was the 12-step way. And that if I kept on running on my self-will, as they categorized it, and refusing to follow the recommendations or really the orders, that they told me that I was going to fail, that I wasn't going to be able to get sober like everybody else. And so it was a problem right away. Literally on day one, they were telling me I had to do something that I could not do. So that was a surprise and a stunner from my point of view.
I'm glad there's a lot more options these days.
Well, they existed then too. They just didn't tell me about them. So, so I'm there, and of course I'm paying, the experts. I assume they're telling me the truth, that this is the one and only way. And I asked several people, and I asked people at 12-step meetings that we went to, as part of the recovery house. We would go to meetings at certain times off of campus, and everyone told me this was it. It was the only way. And so I really had to figure out what I was going to do about that, because I knew I wasn't comfortable. Well, I couldn't do the higher power. I really wasn't happy with the powerless idea or with the focus on defects and some of the other pieces, but they swore this is all there is. There's nothing else. And so I really had to stand back and think about what the heck am I going to do? So I decided that I was just going to do my best to keep my mind open and to look for the ideas that I thought would be helpful and just ignore everything else. And so that's what I did. I mean, rehab, they had a lot of classes that taught me useful information. They taught some of the science of substance use disorder. We had a family dynamics classes. We had, they taught us about things like how to recognize and handle triggers. They recommended group support. We did a lot of exercises and workbooks, and there was useful, valuable information in there that I was able to apply and take advantage of. And I even went through all the 12 steps. I did my best to look for the ideas there that I thought I could use. So I read all of the big book, all of the NA text, all of the other books that they have. And I was looking for, are there core ideas here? Even if I don't agree with all of it, are there other ideas here that I can actually still use? And I did find, some ideas that were helpful. I took the powerless step 1, which I wasn't comfortable with, but I thought about it and I decided that what I could agree with is that Mary Beth is powerless to moderate. Like there is no moderating for Mary Beth. And I took that step 3, turn my will and my life over, which I wasn't going to do, but I thought about it. And I thought, well, I can use it as sort of an idea of limited control, right? And so that I should set my goals and do the work to reach them, but I couldn't always control the outcome. So I sort of tried to do things like that. One day at a time. I found that really helpful. So if I was having a bad craving day, I would say, I'm not deciding for tomorrow, but for today, I'm not going to use. And so I did that. I went through and tried to find all of the ideas that I thought would be useful and apply them. So that was my first effort, was to just try to work with what I was given, which I was told was the entire universe of ideas. Well,
was that the universe of ideas, or did you build off that?
It certainly was not the universe of ideas. So I went home. I ended up staying 5 months. Even, I extended my time. They thought I needed it, and I thought it was probably a good idea. So let me emphasize to your viewers that it's 1994. Okay, there is no Google. Okay, so I went home and I thought, well, first of all, I thought, could it really be true that no atheist in the history of the world has ever gotten sober, right? That seemed unlikely, okay? Unlikely. So I went to the library to see whether there actually were other options. And, I had got my car and I actually had to look up in the phone book. I'd never been to my local library, and I went down to the library, and it turns out, lo and behold, there were other options even in 1994, and they just hadn't told me about them. So I found first Women for Sobriety, which of course still exists today. And Women for Sobriety focuses, it's the first modern secular program, of any kind. And they focus on self-empowerment, releasing the past, taking control of your life. And I really like the introduction, and how we say in 12 step, you say, I'm Mary Beth and I'm an addict. But in Women for Sobriety, you don't introduce yourself that way. You say, I'm Mary Beth and I'm a competent woman. That's the introduction. And for me, in the beginning, I didn't mind saying I'm Mary Beth and I'm an addict. I thought I sort of needed to beat it down into my brain and really, pound it in. But by now it's about 8 months in, and I wasn't comfortable with it anymore. I thought it was too narrow. It wasn't really encompassing the essence of who I was. And I just felt it wasn't helpful. And so when I heard the I'm Mary Beth and I'm a competent woman introduction, I felt like I sort of sat straight and, stood tall. It just felt very empowering, and it was more about where I was at that point, trying to move forward in my life, trying to, become sort of what they call a capable, competent, and confident woman. And so that was really helpful, those ideas. And then I found Rational Recovery, which basically is today's Smart Recovery. And they focused on relapse prevention, and that you actually, your self-will is sufficient to establish a strong recovery foundation. So they view that as a positive, not as a negative, as in rehab. They told me it was a negative. And then I found SOS. secular organization for sobriety, which today basically is LifeRing Secular Recovery. SOS exists, but it's fairly small. LifeRing broke off in 1995 and they're much bigger. And I'm on the board for LifeRing, and they focus on self-empowerment, rational decision-making, and mutual support. And so, yes, there were alternatives even in 1994. Those alternatives exist today, as well as many more, which is really helpful. And you can use the internet and get much easier research done than I had to do. So that's a real great improvement over the last 28 years since I got sober. But I actually ended up not following any one of those programs. I just kept doing the same thing I had done, which was I pulled the ideas that I thought would be useful, and I just sort of synthesized them. And that's what today LifeRing would call building a personal recovery plan. But that's what I did. Today we might call it a hybrid plan or a patchwork plan, but those terms didn't exist then, but that's what I did.
Different things work for everybody.
That's right.
We've come to find that out. And, one path that it might not work the same way. Everyone's life is different. We come into this with different experiences, beliefs, education, like everything. It's so one thing, just you can follow every single rule and it might not work for you, or you can follow no rules and make it work. It's just
And I wanted to highlight right there where Sober Coin asked, what was the number one thing that helps you stay sober?
I think in the long run, it actually was helpful to me to have to find my own path. It really helped me develop a sense of competence, right? I mean, it was scary when they were telling me to do something that I couldn't do. It was frightening because I was looking at 20 years of bad decision-making behind me, right? I had been making poor choices for a long time. And now I'm sort of already on day one questioning the experts. And that was scary because I didn't know if I could trust my own judgment. Was I being arrogant or was I being true to myself? It was a conversation I had with myself repeatedly in the early days. I was afraid that I was just rejecting things and that they might be right. And that if I did that, I was going to fail. So it was frightening. But in the long run, I think having sort of grabbed control of my process, making my own choices, and then doing the work, the research, the analysis to figure out what would be useful to me, that actually really built up my sense of competence, which I didn't have at 20, at 32 after 20 horrible years. And it built up my sense of competence and ability to guide myself forward. And it really increased my confidence that maybe I could trust myself, not that I was going to make perfect decisions, because whatever program we follow, I don't think most of us don't make perfect decisions all the time, but that generally speaking, I was going to be able to move myself in a positive direction. And so that was really helpful. And another idea that I found really useful was that idea of incremental improvements. I really had to learn patience because I wanted my recovery to go at a much faster pace than it did. And I think everyone that I know in early recovery, in my rehab, for example, I think we all hoped we would be fixed in, 6 months, maybe a year. But it turns out it's a longer process than that. And I had to learn to accept the incremental improvement. And that was really useful to really realize I cannot leap from where I am when I walked into the rehab's doors, to where I would be 5 or 10 years later. I couldn't even leap to the job my education technically qualified me for, because I had a horrible resume and, every job, less responsibility, less money. I held it for less time because of my addiction. And I wasn't used to doing normal work things like getting up on time and going to work every day and staying all day and not leaving because I was sick in the afternoon, and doing a good job and doing it the next day and the next. I had to learn how to do that. And so I started at a low-level job because it's all I could handle. And then it was, next job is a higher level. At 6 years sober, I went to law school. At 20 years sober, I was appointed a federal judge. So that acceptance or that realization that recovery required patience and it was going to be a process of incremental improvement, that was a really critical idea for me in recovery.
So what made you decide to go to law school?
Well, law school's a little complicated. I have so many complicated stories. I actually went to law school right out of college, but remember that I had started using meth again in January of my senior year. So by the time I got there, I was in full bore meth use disorder again. I mean, I remember being in the bathroom one time and having this horrible bloody nose. It was ridiculous. So I had to withdraw. I was incapable. I mean, I had gotten accepted to Berkeley Law, it's a top 10 law school, and I withdrew because of my addiction. And that was a horrible pain for me. It was horrible. I mean, I hated even driving near that building. It was agonizing. So when I got sober, I worked my way up from my first job was a temporary low-level part-time admin job. And then my second job was like a mid-level full-time admin job. And then my third job was a supervisor job and at a larger company. And basically I looked at my boss's job and my boss's job, and I didn't want those jobs. So, that means I'm not in the right place. And so I started thinking about, well, maybe I could try law school again, but it was really frightening for me to think about having to explain myself, what had happened, what had gone wrong. Because I had told them it was financial problems or illness or both, I think. And so it was scary to risk applying and being rejected when it was already so painful. But I did decide to do it. And so there's a law school admission test. By now it's like 15 years later. Okay. It's 15 years later. I had to start over from scratch and I should have started over from scratch. I didn't remember the little that I learned. So I studied for the test and then I applied again to Berkeley. And then I also applied to Hastings, which is in San Francisco. And it's a good school, but it's, not a top 10 like Berkeley. And Berkeley rejected me, but Hastings took me. And then, which was exciting. I was going to a pretty good law school. But then I was number 3 in my class of 400. And so then Berkeley took me back and I ended up actually graduating from Berkeley. So that's my long-winded, complicated law school story.
That's pretty cool, though. I mean, that goes to show that nothing's impossible, even if in the moment it feels like you're giving something up. Doesn't mean you can't come back later.
That's exactly right. And sometimes people say, so after law school, I worked at a big law firm, and then I did class action work for the federal government, and then I was appointed in 2014 at 20 years sober, a federal administrative law judge. Well, let me just say, audience, I had no intention or even, inkling that I would ever become a judge when I went into recovery, right? It was really about what's the right next step? What's the right next job? What do I need to do to prepare myself for that next job? And then doing a reasonable time at each step. It wasn't racing forward. I went to law school at 6 years sober, not 3 months sober, 6 years sober. That's how long it took me to get ready for that. And then I had to work, for a number of years before. And so it does, I know, sound like, wow, she, went from, I call my story as I call my book, From Junkie to Judge, One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction. But, I went from junkie to judge over a 20-year period. So it is, I think in early recovery, we don't really have any idea of where we might end up in 6 years or 20 years or even in 2 years, because we're still connecting. We still need that time to connect to who we really are so that we can even understand what we want. And then we have to figure out how to get the skills and the experiences that we need to move on to the next step. But as long as you're always looking ahead to what's the right next step, eventually you can go almost anywhere with that approach. And that's sort of how I look at it.
And I think it's great to point out that just because we have a problem or a disease, it doesn't mean that we're not smart or that we didn't learn skills during that time. to be in active addiction for that long, like that's a hustle. Like a lot of skills were gained that maybe weren't used for good at that time, but can be used to make great progress later. So nothing's wasted.
That's true. That's true. And I will say, in my years in recovery, and I do have 28 years of continuous sobriety at that point, I see more and more people coming in earlier. And I am so happy to see that, that there's no longer this idea that you have to bottom out. I mean, bottoming out, first of all, it was always retrospective, right? Where was your bottom? Well, you don't even know if it was your bottom until you got a couple of years of sobriety. And then maybe you can say that was your bottom. But it's unnecessary to wait until you've destroyed every aspect of your life. The earlier you come in, the less destruction there is. I don't mean to say it's easy. It's going to still be hard, but better today than 5 years from now. And I do see more and more people come in that haven't destroyed themselves, at the level that I had. And I am so happy to see that, because it gives them, they're starting out sort of in the middle of, for me, I had to work my way up over several years to get to where they're starting out professionally, at least. I'm sure, of course, they have their challenges with staying sober and probably have some emotional damage and other areas to work on. But I just do love seeing people coming in more at a higher rate before they've absolutely destroyed their entire life and every aspect of it. So, yay.
Brett's one of those. Brett,
Yeah.
how old were you when you came into recovery?
23.
Oh, see, that's fabulous.
Yeah. And I love seeing collegiate recovery. Like those, like, I don't want to say kids because they're young adults, but like they are some awesome people that are going to do some amazing things. And a lot of them have. I mean, like Greg Williams, he came in real young and he's killing it out there.
Yeah, I wish I would have come in earlier. I remember when I went into recovery, I said to somebody in my rehab, I go, I never even tried to stop before. They're looking like it was something to be proud of, And she looked at me and she goes, girl, you kind of look like you should have, Yeah, I did look like I should have. She was right. But we get this twisted thinking sometimes that it's like, yeah, I hadn't even tried. But it wasn't even 100% true. I had certainly tried to moderate. I'd had a lot of different patterns. I tried, to wait 3 days in between runs and to only use on the weekend or maybe you do a run on the weekend and try to use half as much during the week. All kinds of crazy patterns that I tried that just failed, or I could do them for a month or two and then I couldn't anymore. And so it wasn't that I never tried to moderate it. I just had never really tried to stop. And a lot of that was because I didn't believe that I could. I really didn't believe that I could. I honestly thought that because of the trauma, that using was my best option. I believed, I was wrong, but I believed that if I stopped using, I was either going to commit suicide or I was going to end up institutionalized. That's what I thought was going to happen. That this using drugs was the best way to manage my pain, that there was no better option than this. This was as good as it was going to get for me. And so even when I went into rehab, I wasn't committed to abstinence. I wanted to figure out how to use less, how to do better. Not that I wanted to keep using, but using less was sort of as far as my imagination could go. And I think sometimes we don't fully acknowledge that coming in to recovery, ambivalence is common. It's sometimes there's pressure for people to be, if they're not 100% committed 100% of the day, 100% of the week, 100% of the month, that somehow they're going to not succeed. Whereas I think it's typical and common for people to have that initial ambivalence, to be 100% committed, for a week. And then you have a day where you're just, well, maybe I can use, or maybe I can't do it, and to have that back and forth. I think it's normal in early recovery. And I know when I talk to newcomers, I encourage them to be honest about it and talk it out rather than presenting a sort of a false front of 100% commitment 100% of the time.
And that's why one day at a time, 1 hour at a time, 1 minute at a time. That's why that's a thing, because, you know, get through the day, then get through the next day, or get through the hour.
That's true. That's true. I mean, it's a good point that if you focus on the one day, it can be helpful because you're not having to say never yet. I mean, at some point for me, it became never, right? But certainly not in the beginning. But even in those one days, people are often have that, questioning. They have second thoughts. They're not 100% sure. I know sometimes when people are young, they think, well, do I really have a substance use disorder? Maybe I'm exaggerating. I mean, there's all those second guessings that happen. And I just want to make sure that the newcomers are comfortable openly talking about those feelings or those thoughts, so that's second guessing, and not feeling like they have to have some kind of pretense of being more certain about their commitment than they actually are.
And I think it's important to have a place that you can be honest about that. I've been in some rooms where people are like, are you allowed to do this? Yeah, you can do that, but don't talk about it. And it's like, secrets and shame are what got me here. So you think I can do that and get better. So it's like, if you can't, if it's not a place that you can be honest and talk through things, and it might not be the place for you.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And sometimes it really isn't the program. It's individuals can get a little bit carried away with, ideas that they sort of make up or they misinterpret. And that can be problematic sometimes for newcomers. And so, yes, I really, as you say, I hope the newcomers, if you're not in a place where you can openly talk about what you're thinking and feeling about your recovery, then I agree with you, Ashley. Then you're not, there's a better place for you, and seek that out, someplace where you can do that. It's going to be much more helpful to you. And you're going to be able to have a clearer path to your stronger recovery foundation if you're able to talk about these things up front. I think it's common, and so I hope people don't feel I don't know, like somehow their commitment is less than it should be. I'm telling you, I walked in ambivalent. Okay. In fact, I also used 3 times in my first 5 months. I used 3 times in my first 5 months, including twice in rehab. But 3 times in 5 months was a lot better. If I had been able to use 3 times in 5 months on a regular basis, I wouldn't have been in rehab. But I have 28 years now. I used 3 times in the first 5 months, and I walked in ambivalent, and now I have 28 years. So I view my pattern as actually fairly common.
Yeah, I think that the research shows that normally there's at least 3 occurrences, 3 to 8 or something, isn't it? I'm not. Most people, it's not a one and done. If it is a one and done, you're very lucky, or maybe not. I mean, I think that you learn something from each time. So, like I said, there's no time wasted.
And I like what Mary Beth said about the forever thing, because I can attest to that. Coming in at 23, thinking about I'm never going to use again. Forever's a long time. I definitely wasn't committed to I'm never going to use again when I first came in. I came in and I originally came in when I was 21, and I had 2 years of back and forth. And then at 23 was when I had this conversation with the guy, and I was like, all right, I'm going to give this recovery thing 1 year. I'll give it 1 solid year where I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to dabble. Like, you got 1 year. And here I am, I'm coming up on 8 years next month, but I didn't plan on it being forever. It was like, my life is not how I want it to be. I don't enjoy it. But what are the alternatives? At that point I was at a place where it was like, I can either continue to do what I'm doing and be miserable, or I can try this recovery thing and see what happens.
That's right. And, the other thing that makes me think about is how sometimes there's this message that recovery is a fight every day for the rest of your life. And the reality is that's not true for most people, right? For most of us, we get to a place of solid recovery. I mean, I haven't had a serious struggle with staying sober in 25 of my 28 years. And it doesn't mean it couldn't happen. And it doesn't mean that I've forgotten. And it doesn't mean that I play around the edges, because I don't. Sometimes people will say to me, well, you have 28 years. Can't you have a beer? It's like, no, I can't. No, I can't. Because I really believe that if I picked up anything, and let's say it was a beer, I mean, I might get away with it the first time. I probably would. But the problem would become that I think I would start negotiating with myself right away, right? It would be, well, if I got away with this one time, how often can I have a beer and it won't be trouble, or that it's okay? And then it's going to be, well, if I can have a beer, I can have pot. What if I just did meth on my birthday? Like, I mean, this is where my mind would go. I know it. And so that's why I don't play with it, because look, it's nice that I became a judge. It sounds great. It was a professional accomplishment. I'm proud of it. But the biggest joy of recovery to me is the lack of chaos and the lack of obsession, right? My brain is not sucked up with all that chaotic misery or thoughts about when can I use and how am I going to use. And I mean, it's all gone. My mind is free from all of that. And I really don't ever want to put myself in that position again. This is a joy to be free of that.
And then we had a question from Paige. She said, how do you deal with stress? I have 2 years and I'm certain in my sobriety, but as of late, I'm having issues with stress management.
So I will say, remember, I had child abuse of multiple forms. I actually had 2 multi-salient sexual assaults, and there were other sexual assaults, that we would call them that now because of the new idea that you actually have to consent, which idea wasn't really strong when I was a teenager. But so I had PTSD and severe anxiety, and I didn't know it when I went into recovery. And so for me, the bigger challenge than getting my substance use disorder, what was harder and what took longer, was getting my anxiety under control. And I really tended to catastrophize. I had a very negative outlook. I was always waiting for the world to explode in my face. I always felt that whatever I had accomplished, let's say my first year of sobriety, year and a half, one little mistake, and I was going to lose it all. I was going to blow up in my face if I made any little error. And that is a high stress attitude that, is really not maintainable. Even though I was making good choices and moving forward, I wasn't even really enjoying my accomplishments the way I should have, because I was always worried about the next minute. My husband called me the "what about tomorrow" girl. Like, everything could be great now, but my mind was already on what could go wrong tomorrow. And so for me, I really had to address that PTSD and that anxiety and that stress. And so I did individual therapy with someone who had expertise in substance use disorder and in trauma. And then I did group therapy with a women's group that had trauma histories. And that was really, really helpful to me, provided me with a lot of new information about the many, many ways that the trauma had impacted me. I knew the high level ways, but I didn't see all the nuances of the impact until I was in that group therapy. And I also did medication for several years, and I tried a bunch of meds and they didn't help. And then finally, after not trying for a while, I was on a new one for a different reason, and it helped me significantly. And I used that for several years. So, but it was a process. I mean, I still struggle with my anxiety. I say I'm 95%, recovered from that PTSD. I still struggle with it, but I have, the episodes are much less frequent and they're much less intense and they last a lot less time. So I think it's common for a lot of people in sobriety. They find, now that they're sober, they realize they have depression or they have anxiety. A lot of people in recovery, women, but men too, have trauma histories like I did, and they need to do that work in order to get their emotions in balance, in order to process the harm that's been done to them, so that they can move forward, so that we can move forward and live our best life. So it was a process for me. It was, again, incremental improvement, step by step, using different techniques, getting the expertise that I needed to help me. So that's what it was like for me. It was a process.
What was it like when you started becoming a judge, or even just at first as a lawyer?
I mean, getting back into law school and especially back into Berkeley, it really was a proud moment for me. I felt like it was part of sort of reconnecting to my original self, sort of the woman I would have been if not for my substance use disorder. So that I felt sort of a weight lifted that I was able to regain it. I mean, it was 16 years later by the time I got back to law school, but still, I was able to regain it. And I got, really good grades at Berkeley Law, and I had a high-end job at a big law firm. And that was also a point of pride that I not only got in, but that my grades were high enough to land this job, this competitive job. But on the other hand, I did that job for a couple of years, and yeah, it was challenging work, and they paid me good money, but it was a job that you basically committed your life to. I say they owned me. That paycheck, they bought all of my time basically. And so I had another decision point. It was sort of like I climbed up that mountain from that temporary part-time low-level admin job when I first got out of rehab to this high-end legal job. But as much as I felt proud about it, I really at that point realized I didn't want to keep doing it. And so it was that other inflection point of having to decide what's my life going to look like going forward. And it was hard. It was a hard decision because it's one of those things that once you leave a job like that, you're not going to get it back. It was really a permanent decision. And it was, I grew up in a working class family. We didn't really have money. And so to give up a salary like that was caused me some second thoughts. But I really was at that point in my recovery that I decided that I didn't want to keep living like that. It wasn't my priority. Those things were not my priority. I wanted more time for myself, more time to be with my husband, more time to, take vacation, to go to the ballet instead of having to give my ticket to my girlfriend. So my husband would take her. He started calling her his second wife because she went to everything that I couldn't go to. And so it was another decision point about that. So yeah, it was a process. And then becoming a judge was sort of a surprise. Once I became a government lawyer, I saw other people who did it. And so I thought, well, maybe, I'll think about it. And it's not the kind of judge where you go to Congress and testify. It's administrative law judge. It's a testing process, a hard sort of multi-level, you take this part of the test and they cut a whole bunch of people out and it's multi-step. But becoming a judge was a proud day, especially because I had started out as a teenage IV meth addict. And that's when I started thinking about the book, because it was really like, how the heck did I do this? How did I go from an abused child, a teenage IV meth addict, to a judge? And that was a time of great reflection. And that's when I started taking notes for my book.
Well, and I mean, that's pretty amazing if you think about just life in general. You said you started out, you're born to an unwed mother and you lived with nuns at the beginning. Like, how many stories are there that they become judges one day?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, the other thing that I never expected, to be honest, was my marriage. I mean, I've been with my husband for 38 years. I met him my senior year of college, and he was there through the last years of my addiction. He was actually ready to throw me out when I finally went to rehab. But I'll tell you, that's almost the bigger surprise for me, is to be in a happy, functional, supportive, loving marriage of 38 years. That was something it never even crossed my mind existed on earth, much less that I would get to have it, So it's the professional achievements are nice, but the life achievements are really what sustain me, and so it's those kind of things that are more important. I'm proud of what I've done professionally, but on a day-to-day basis, being a good wife, being a good sister, being a good friend. I'm on the board for LifeRing and She Recovers, doing that service, just and being part of a happy partnership with my husband. Those are the things that are the greatest joys and the most sustenance in recovery for me.
So I have a question, and you don't have to answer it. It might be very personal, and I hope it's not. But was he the first person that never gave up on you? Like you thought he was about to, but he didn't really.
He definitely was the first person that was really supportive. I had a boyfriend in high school who was a nice guy. I wasn't in any way ready for that, and we were young. But yeah, don't get me wrong. I think my husband should have kicked me out years before he was ready to. If he would have been smart, like what was he thinking? I don't know. I was out of control. But when we dated and we didn't live together, he thought I was like a weekend user. He didn't know until we moved in that I was really deep in my addiction. And he stuck around. It was 6 years later after we moved in together that he was getting really at the end of his rope. And when I was in rehab, he didn't know. He didn't know if he was going to stick around. I mean, he would say that, how they have those family counseling sessions in rehab, and he would tell her, I don't know. It might be too late, so it was scary. But once he saw that I was trying hard, and that I was committed and that I was making the effort, he agreed to try, and so we went to couples counseling. We did couples counseling seriously for several years. And I would say it was probably maybe at a year and a half of my sobriety that I was pretty sure we were going to stick together. In fact, when I had 2 years sober, that's when we booked the venue to get married, because we lived together, but he had not been foolish enough to get married to me when I was still using. So he had some sense. But yeah, it's certainly, he sees me. He remembers things about me. He notices things. If I tell him I'm going to go do X, when I come home, he'll ask me how it went. He is so excited for me, like with the book. He's just always sure that anything that I try to do, I can do. He's just always there for me, and it is an experience I did not have as a child. So it's something that I really do value very much. And I really do notice. I love to see his face light up when I get to tell him something, that, I got the op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and, he just looks so happy and so proud. It just warms my heart. It really does. Yes. So yes, long story short, yes, it's a great joy to be with him and to have that relationship.
And it's hard because, there's people that get taught how to be a wife and how to eat, but there's a lot of people that don't get taught how to do it. And sometimes it's hard to figure it out. And it's really amazing that you guys were able to figure it out together.
Yeah. I mean, what that also reminds me of is how much work I had to do in recovery. Like my interpersonal skills were horrible. I mean, I could be aggressive if I felt threatened or challenged or fear, I could strike out because that's what I grew up with, and so it took me a long time to really get my words under control, and then to get my tone under control took even longer. And to actually be able to listen and hear, that was a process. I mean, you guys are seeing me now, and even now I have it a little bit, but it was work. I didn't know how to communicate. I didn't know how to listen. I didn't know how to be open to input. I was always, I was defensive. I was afraid if you criticized me, I would lash back out. It's just what I grew up with. It took a long time. It took time for me to see that it was even a problem. And then even once I recognized that it was a problem, it took a long time. And again, that step-by-step incremental improvements to get it under control. It took years for me to get that under control, many years for me to get it fully under control is probably an exaggeration, but it was a process where I was better and better and better, and the worst events happened less often. But it took a long time to really be to the point that it would take a heck of a lot for me to react that way today. A heck of a lot.
Yeah, and that's work. And it doesn't stop, unfortunately. Well, fortunately and unfortunately, it's continual forever. I mean, I don't know. Maybe there's some people that find, oh, I've gotten to a point I'm good enough and I don't want to improve. But every time I find something that I think I've fixed, I find 5 more things to fix. So I don't see my process ending anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely still do have areas that I could improve on. I don't want to make it sound like it's 100%. It's just that it's such a vast difference. But on the other hand, I mean, other than the things like interpersonal, as far as like challenges of life, where I feel like I am now is that I have this calm, comfortable base, which allows me to sort of spread my wings and take risks because I'm coming from that comfortable base. I mean, for me to be open about my recovery was a big step. I really hadn't been public about it until after I retired as a judge for multiple reasons. But I had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in 2020. It was called "I Beat Addiction Without God," and I announced, as I say, you can't really be more open in your recovery. They turn out in the Wall Street Journal that you're a former meth addict. But that was a risk, right? And that also reflected on my husband. We had that conversation. I said, if I come out, I'm coming out for us. You know what I mean? Like, so are you ready for that? People will ask questions about you, and so it was to the point that I felt like I could be of use because I really wanted to talk. To be part of the conversation, to push the conversation forward about multiple paths to recovery. And I felt because I have so much time, 28 years of a secular recovery at this point, and because the judge gets attention, it's sort of people view it as it has a positive resonance in society. And so I thought people might notice what I had to say a little bit more, and so that I could be of use to people who couldn't always talk because people legitimately worry about professional consequences, or they just don't want to, which is everybody's right to choose. So, but because I have that, support at home, because I have that basically calm life, it lets me take more risks than I would be able to take if I was living, already, if I was already living on the edge, if I was already, right up against the edge. So it is really helpful to have a good partner in life. If you can get a good partner in life, it's useful.
Well, so you got the good partner, you went through law school, you became a judge, you started writing the day you became a judge. Where'd you go from there?
Yeah. So, I mean, when I became a judge, I remember I actually went to judge school for a month. We go to judge school when you're an administrative law judge. And I started taking notes for the book then in 2014. And I didn't finish it until 2021 because I had a full-time job and I didn't know how to write a book. So I had to figure it out. Took classes and, practiced and revised and revised and revised. But I really wanted to do a couple things in the book. And again, the title does capture what I was trying to do. It's From Junkie to Judge, One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction. So I really cover in the book the abuse and traumas that led me to start using alcohol at 12 and to start using meth at 16. I wanted to show why that decision made sense to me at the time. It's that it wasn't out of the blue, that it wasn't for no reason, that there were root causes that led me to make that choice and to keep on making those bad choices about more and more drugs. I don't mean to say that I think it was a choice forever, but in the beginning it was. It seemed like a good idea at the time. It seemed to help me with my pain. But also the data shows that people with trauma histories, sexual assault histories, child abuse histories, also who start using drugs at a young age, all are much more likely to develop a substance use disorder. So I wanted that. How did it happen? Why did it happen? And then I do go through the chaos and misery of my addiction, but then I also go through about 30% of the book is my first 3 years of recovery. And I do feel sometimes like memoirs end with, I went to a few meetings and everything was great. And that's just not how recovery works. I wanted to give a more realistic picture, but also because I did it not the most common path, which most common path is the 12-step path. I did it the secular way and I did it an individual way. I thought it was important to show what that looks like and how I did it. Not that someone else's path would be identical to mine, but just as an example of a way of thinking. And I do in the back of the book have guidelines and checklists to help people think through about what their program might look like, what might work for them. It's sort of an analytical tool. And so I wanted to include that as well, just to lay out something of a structure that people could think through as to what might be the first right steps for them.
I think that's awesome because a lot of times you just don't know when you're starting out. You have no clue what to do.
That's true. And it's funny because sometimes people say to me, well, how do I know which of the many like peer support programs are going to be a good fit? And I do hope it's clear that I have no concerns about 12 steps if it's a good fit for someone. Yay, if those are your people, I'm happy for you. But when I talk at recovery houses, they'll say, well, how do I know what's right for me? And my answer to that really is, I think if you read up on the different peer support options, let's say you already read up on the top 5 or 6, I really think that 1 or 2 of them, they're going to be attractive to you. It's going to sound like my people are going to be at that meeting. That philosophy is consistent with my worldview. That meeting format sounds like I would enjoy it. So I think if you look at them, you're going to find that 1 or 2 are more attractive to you than the others. And so my recommendation is always start there. Go to where it looks like you're going to fit in. And then, of course, always, as I did, keep your mind open. Is it working? Do you want to add in another program? You don't actually have to do any one program. You can do more than one at the same time. That's what I did. And that's what more people do today. I'm on the board for She Recovers Foundation as well, which is a multiple paths program. They support all paths. And there's a lot of different options. So I would look at them and see where you feel like you're going to fit in, where you feel like the philosophy is consistent with how you think. But always keep your mind open. And sometimes what works for you, let's say the first year, maybe at that point you want to add something else in. I mean, our recovery needs change over time. How we think about recovery changes over time, especially in the beginning. What we think will work for us can change over time. So it's good to start out in one place, but always know that if you reevaluate and you want to change something up, look at the other options again and see what you might want to add in to strengthen your recovery.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to say because you grow and you change, and who you are 5 years down the road isn't who you came in as, and what worked then might not work today. And sometimes you outgrow things, or you outgrow groups. You don't want to be, that's one of the things that I say. I don't want to be the smartest person in the room, then I'm in the wrong room. And, like some people might want to be, but if you're going to continually grow, you can't be, the person with the most time or the person, it's, and I'm not saying that that's bad, but if you're continually wanting to learn, if everyone in the room's at 3 years, how do you get past that? And,
Right.
And I mean, like for me, my pathway was different when I started. The first 2 years was a completely different pathway than what I use today. And I don't even know that what I use today would be considered. It's the Ashley way. People joke, like it's because I do so many different things. And I just have to change it up and do what works for me. And, like She Recovers I went to the event in Miami, and, that's a great, the meetings were structured completely different than any other meetings that I've ever been to. And it was great seeing women support women, because that's something you don't see in the real world every day.
Yeah, and She Recovers is different than some of the other groups because it's not just for substance use disorder recovery, right? It's also for recovery from trauma, mental health, or other behavioral disorders like gambling or eating, grief. I mean, the mantra is we're all in recovery from something. But the reality is that most women and most men in recovery have more than just their substance use disorder to work on, or that's an area of concern, something that they want to repair. And so when She Recovers, it's all in one place. And so it's got sort of that unique niche. But a lot of She Recovers members also do 12 steps. A lot of LifeRing members also do SMART, or also do Women for Sobriety. It's more common what you're doing now, Ashley, and what I did, which is to mix it up. And I think that's a real positive change over my 28 years in recovery, is that more people are open to trying out different modalities, doing 2 or more programs at the same time. Some people like the structure of 12 steps in the beginning, but then they want to check out other options. And so, whatever you think will strengthen your sobriety, to me, that's what you need to do. And you're the only person who knows what's going to work for you, and when it's time to try something new or take another step. And that's a good thing. I mean, that's a good thing. The good news is there are a lot of options. The other reality is that, a lot of people don't do peer support meetings forever. After the 3 years, I think between year 3 and year 24, 25, when I joined the LifeRing board, I've been in those 15 years. I went to a dozen meetings, maybe 20. And so it's, but I was still in therapy, and I was still doing other areas of growth because that's what I needed. So it's okay to, and I think it's important to do the analysis about, every few months, where am I? Is what I'm doing working? Is there something that I'd like to try that I think could strengthen either my substance use recovery, or my mental health recovery, or my trauma recovery, or just my professional growth, or, new challenges of life, all of that. It's good to evaluate it fairly regularly, so that you can be pushing yourself forward in the right way, in the way that you really would like to go.
Well, and I think there was something you said a while back that I didn't comment on, but it's become glaringly obvious to me the more stories I hear, and the more rooms I sit in, that I've heard it probably 5 times in the last month, is people said that they used because that's what kept them alive. Like their option, like you said before, that they would have wanted to end their life if it wasn't for that was. And I mean, there was a long time for me, like where I felt like I was dead. I was just surviving. But there's that whatever that is, that make people need, I don't know how to verbalize this, but whatever that is that makes you think that substance is keeping you alive, that needs to be addressed if you're going to be able to ever truly live. And that's the whole point of finding recovery, is so that you're free and you can truly live. So if you don't ever address that reason that you needed to just survive, how do you ever live?
Yeah. And, I think it's interesting too. When I went into recovery, they actually didn't want to treat us with medication for mental health until we were sober for 90 days or something, because they said, we don't know where you are if you even need these meds. But now there's a much more emphasis on simultaneously addressing mental health and substance use disorder. And I think the data shows that that's the better approach. The other thought I have when you say that is that I knew that my trauma was the impetus of my substance use disorder. And that was true. But what I hadn't realized was that my substance use disorder had become my number one problem, and that was a surprise to me when I went into recovery to find out, yes, it's true that it started because of the trauma, but it has now surpassed the trauma as my number one problem. And I was not able to heal from the trauma until I got sober. I actually went to therapy a couple times when I was still using, and I couldn't make any progress. I mean, I wasn't connected to my emotions. I actually didn't have an accurate sense of my own history. I couldn't really appreciate the depth and severity of everything that had happened to me. But mostly, how can you heal from trauma if you've got a drug between you and your true feelings? It's impossible. And so it was for me, I needed sobriety to be able to really make progress on my mental health. But I'm glad that today there's more analysis and evaluation of people early in the process to see what mental health support they need while they're in their early sobriety.
Yeah, and sometimes you need medication at the beginning.
Yes.
Like you said, you were on medication early. Especially with opiate use disorder, your brain doesn't make the chemicals that make you happy, for a year after. So it's like depression medicine or, medication assisted therapy. Those might be the best options for you at that time. But I was on depression medicine for the first 2 years I was in recovery, and I'm no longer on it now, but I don't know that I would have made it without that.
Yeah, I mean, the medication-assisted treatment for alcohol use disorder and opiate use disorder that's an amazing step forward, and the data is so strong on the odds of success with that on, abstinence, even if it's not perfect, but, if abstinence overall and significantly reduced use. I mean, unfortunately for stimulants, they're still trying to find something that works well, but there are some studies going on. There are some larger studies on a couple drugs for stimulants to help to do the same kind of replacement that it does for alcohol and opiates. But it's really amazing how strong the data is about the success rates with medication assisted treatment. I think particularly about alcohol, because in a way alcohol has an additional challenge because it's everywhere in the world. I mean, people weren't, at a party handing me meth, right? They were trying to give me a drink. And so, I mean, I can't drink. Don't get me wrong. I don't drink. When I got sober, I made my husband move the alcohol out of the house for 2 years because I didn't want that impulse relapse. I didn't want, if I had to get in my car and go to the 7-Eleven, at least there was a gap in time. So it's not that I drink, but alcohol does have that extra challenge that you're faced with it, constantly out in the real world and on television with commercials and things. And so having the medication, it's a real advantage for people that have alcohol use disorder and opiate use disorders. Yeah.
Well, and I think the studies show that those are good for like the first 2 years. They're the best, but then you still have to find something that works for long term, because I think that the studies that I've shown, it drops off severely after 2 years. So it gives you those 2 years to get stable and find something that works. You find your people, whoever your people are, whatever pathway is your pathway.
Yeah, and in 2 years, your brain changes a lot. I mean, I've seen brain scans of people like that are on, meth or alcohol at the time, and then 3 months sober, 6 months sober, a year, 2 years. It's astonishing how much repair your brain has to go through during those first 2 years. So getting someone through 2 years is like a major accomplishment. It's not yeah, you're right. It's good to be simultaneously working on the other aspects of it, so that when you get to that point, you're strong in other ways as well. But as we all know, it's those early parts that are the hardest. So when I went from like 27 to 28, and people were like, "Yay, happy birthday!" I'm like, "Come on, 27 to 28 is not the hard part." Okay, that's just not the hard part. It's those first two to 3 years where you're really getting that foundation, where your brain is rewiring, where you're trying to develop new positive habits in all areas of your life. But also, I think those years are hard because we're having to face what we've destroyed, right? I mean, it's hard to look at your life and where you are and what you've lost and what you yourself, what havoc you yourself created. That's painful, and it makes it really a challenge. And usually, hopefully, if you're doing good work, by 2 or 3 years, you've at least made forward progress, and you can, and some of those feelings you've been able to address, or to at least they're not as strong as they were in the beginning, because you see that you're on a positive forward path.
Yeah, and I think there's like this is just my opinion, so don't take it with a grain of salt, but I think that there's still so much stigma, and there shouldn't be, for medication assisted therapy, so that it's harder for them like to find something during, because people aren't as accepting. And I think that there's nothing wrong with being on medication assisted therapy for the rest of your life if you're able to live. Recovery, abstinence isn't the definition of recovery.
Yeah, well, and how do you define abstinence? I mean, to me, if you're on a medication that's prescribed for a medical condition that you have, and you take it as prescribed, that to me, that's abstinence. That's abstinence. But you're right. I mean, people, the percentage of people that have access to medication assisted treatment is ridiculously low, especially considering how effective it is. And then people do get into this thing like, well, methadone, it's, you're just high on another drug. But the reality is maintenance methadone, if it's done right, isn't getting you high. It's just making you level. I have a girlfriend who's been on maintenance methadone for 12 years, and she was not able to stay off. She tried abstinence without, methadone from heroin for years, and she could not succeed. On a maintenance level dose of methadone, she's got a job, she's got a promotion, she's able to be a good mother, she's able to participate in life. And when you talk to her, she's not high. I mean, I know what opiate high looks like. She's not high. It's just, she's just brought up to a normal, stable level. Her brain's not producing what it needs to produce. She's tried to see if it will ever, some people, it's like with mental health meds. For some of us, you're on mental health meds for a while. I was on them for 3.5 years. And then I was able to go off, and I didn't get worse again. Well, I tried to go off at 2 years, and I did get worse. And so went back on, and I was on for 1.5 years, and then I went off and I didn't get worse. But some people have to take mental health meds forever because their brain never recovers. It never repairs. And that's how I view medication assisted treatment. It's the same thing. If you can get off it later, and I know most people try, that's great. But if you can't, it's certainly way better than the alternative,
I agree.
You just need to, look at medication assisted therapy just the same way we do depression medicine or Tylenol for a headache or whatever, to make it so that they can't have a place to recover because of what they need to recover is ridiculous. And that's why I think that 2-year thing is such a big, there's a really, it's in the 90s with when they reach 2 years, and then it drops off to 30%. And I really think that it's because there's just not a lot of recovery groups that are as welcoming as they should be.
Yeah. And I will say that in LifeRing, our definition of abstinence includes a medication that is medically indicated and taken as prescribed. And that can include things like some people do cannabis for anxiety, right? And if the doctor tells them that that's okay, that's between them and their doctor. We don't get in the middle of that. People sometimes have to be on pain meds for physical conditions. we don't get we don't get in the middle. It's not our job. We can't make that assessment. And so LifeRing considers abstinence as long as you're taking it as prescribed. It's for a legitimate medical need, that counts as abstinence. And She Recovers is a multiple paths. She Recovers doesn't even require you to commit to abstinence. It's your decision as to what you want to do. And so there are groups that are open to that. If any of your listeners are in that situation and have had problems finding them, they do exist.
I always think that that's good to point out, because sometimes, especially rural areas, they don't always have the options, or if you don't know, even though there's the internet, if you don't know where to look sometimes, or if you just have your phone, or you're just starting out and everything seems so big and you don't realize that there's so much out there and there's people that'll support you. I think it's important to point out.
Yeah, I mean, my goal is always just to talk about, to inform people they have choices so they can find what's going to work for them. I mean, look, I'm on the board for LifeRing. Come to LifeRing. I don't really care if LifeRing is not the right fit for you. Go where your people are. I just want people to know that they have choices so that they can find the right fit and increase their odds of success. That really is my primary goal when I talk. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. I think we all are. Brett too, right?
Yes.
I don't want to speak for you.
No, you're fun. You're fun. I agree.
And we learn more. Like, what I think today is completely different than when I first got into recovery. I was like the worst when I first got in. They're telling me about naloxone and Narcan, and I was like, well, are we giving them permission to use by giving but I'm going to tell you that today, because of my judgments and where I was, I can talk to people and I understand what I need to say and what they're things that they might be thinking, but they don't want to say because it comes out a little judgy, and so I really believe that even though I was judgy when I started, I think that helps me today be able to help other people be less judgy. And I've opened to, I fully admit I was judgy.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things I do acknowledge is that I actually used harm reduction in my last 5 years of using. I used the needle exchange in San Francisco, and the needle, it wasn't legal. It was tolerated. So, I mean, they had the needle exchange, and I'm pretty sure it was a private group that was doing it. But there was an 800 number you had to call and find out where they were going to be. And but the cops would just drive by. They would just drive by. They weren't enforcing anything. And that was helpful to me because I think it's a big part of the reason why when I got sober, I didn't have HIV, I didn't have Hep C, I never had any of the blood-borne diseases. And I know that it can be counterintuitive for people to think about giving people, syringes that somehow you're encouraging them to use, or why should we be doing this? In San Francisco, in the 90s, the syringe exchanges started because of HIV. It was viewed as, this is the better of two options, right? Either people are going to get HIV or we're going to give them easy access to syringes. But today it's also just part of the overall harm reduction movement. But I understand why people have concerns. I don't want to dismiss those concerns. I think you're right, Ashley, to take it as, how can I explain it to you, provide the information now that I've thought about it, now that I have more data, now that I understand the benefits. Let me be respectful about your concerns, your understandable concerns, but explain why, you think it's still a good idea and why the data shows that it's actually a helpful idea.
And I think a big thing too is that even though when I first came in, I was against a lot of this stuff, I still did the research. People told me, well, if somebody's not having an overdose, if you give them naloxone, it's not going to hurt them. I didn't believe that, but I didn't just say, I don't believe you and stop there. I did the research and I found out what they were saying was true. It wasn't going to make them sicker. And so what they were saying was true. And so I came back and listened a little bit more because they had proven what they weren't selling me lies, and, then it was like, well, we need to have naloxone at all the schools and all. I'm like, wait, you're going to give this medication to kids that are under 18? What? Like, but then now I'm a full firm believer it needs to be in every high school, every college, every dorm room. And I train people how to use it. And so just be open to what you believe is not always the truth too.
Well, isn't that the beauty of recovery? Is that we get to learn these new ideas, and our ideas can change. I mean, I think even just hearing Mary Beth's story and so many other people's stories, I think we come into recovery with a lot of limiting beliefs about ourselves and what we can do. And I mean, that's to me, that's one of the core things about recovery, is that I'm able to change my ideas and grow and try different things. And like we've discussed tonight, if I'm in a program that's not working for me, that I have freedom to try something different. I can try a LifeRing or a Smart Recovery, or I can do harm reduction or whatever it is. That's part of the beauty of recovery, is that we can grow and change and try different things and learn new perspectives. Because when I first got into recovery, I didn't think I could be anything. I didn't think that I could be successful. I didn't think I could have a family. I didn't think I was able to do any of those things, because I had those beliefs about myself that I was worthless and that I was, destined to be an addict for the rest of my life. And that's kind of the whole thing about recovery, is the hope and being able to learn and see new things and gain new perspectives.
Yeah, and that's great that you're able to do that. And I think it's why people talk about recovery versus sobriety, right? I mean, don't get me wrong, getting sober is really it was really important, but it is an opportunity to start working on all aspects of ourselves and to really change our mindset in so many ways, and that could have. I mean, for me in recovery, once I got sober after about the first year and a half, I started talking about I wanted big R recovery, right? I wanted to really be in recovery for all of it, not just for my substance use disorder. And again, there's so much overlap for people that enter recovery for substance use disorder. So many of us have trauma histories or other bad experiences, neglect. I don't know, loss of a parent, just a lot of different types of harms that if we stop the substances, it's an opportunity to start working on things that when we were young, when they initially happened, we didn't have the tools to deal with, and probably we didn't have the good adult guidance to help us through that process. But now we really have to sort of figure out how to move ourselves through the process. And when I say myself, that, my recovery, I did it my way. I never mean I did it alone, right? I really view self-empowered recovery as including asking for the help that you need. I did a lot of meetings my first few years of all types, 12 steps, and then Women for Sobriety and SOS and Rational Recovery. I did individual therapy, group therapy, couples counseling, medication. It was a process of addressing all the areas that needed to be healed. And then just also paying attention to my own poor behavior at many times and trying to figure out how to improve that. So it's a multi-pronged attack to really try to find your way to your true self, to who you were meant to be, but also who do I want to be? I remember snapping at people, and then at some point it was like, I don't want to be her. I don't want to behave like that. I am not happy with myself when I behave like that. So I need to figure out how to move past it. And that's sort of the whole process of recovery. What about our life? What about our pain? What about our behavior are we not happy with? And work on that, prioritize it, set goals step by step, always step by step, and move toward who you want to become. And often that's partly who you really originally were meant to be.
Yeah, and I think we don't know who we're meant to be until we get there, right?
Yeah, although I did spend time in early recovery thinking about who I was initially. I really thought back to who I was as a girl before the worst of the trauma happened, before I picked up substances. Like, I was always smart, I was always verbal, was always outgoing, but I had lost those things. I had become so disconnected from myself. I wasn't any of those things when I walked into recovery. And so part of it was trying to remember who I was, partly just to sort of as a goal, but also to remind myself that inside of me are those things. I can use them to my advantage. I can use my, intellect to my advantage. I can use my outgoing personality in general to my advantage. If I can reconnect to my original self, my original personality, my original skills, that will help me in my recovery. Those things were already there. I just lost the connection to them. I could rebuild the connection, and that's going to help me move forward.
Well, I think the next question I have to ask is, how did it feel to write a book?
Yeah, I mean, it was a long process, but as I said, I started taking notes in 2014 when I became a judge, and I finished it in 2021. But it was a multi-tiered process. So there was the writing side, and I was a good writer. I was a really good legal writer. I was a good business writer, but I had never written a book. And memoir is really written like a novel. It has to be written immersive, in scene. You want the reader to feel it as it happened, the emotional connection. And I hadn't written anything like that in my life. And so I had to learn how to do it. And that was an intellectual challenge that was sort of fun, I took classes, and then I tried to apply what I learned, and then I would revise it. I was in critique groups where we read each other's work. But it's memoir. So there was also the emotional side of it, really reevaluating what had happened to me, thinking about it in a way I hadn't really thought about it in a long time, remembering exactly what happened and how it impacted me, because that's part of what memoir is explaining not just what happened, but how did that impact my life at the time? How do I interpret it now? What patterns do I see that need to be addressed? And so that was emotional work, to be looking deeply inside and looking at these events with a very close eye. And so that was upsetting at times. It was also a reminder of how lucky I am to be alive. I had so many experiences where I could easily have been killed. And so there was that appreciation that I really am lucky to still be here. But also I really did reconnect to myself, to some of my strengths. Like that multi-assailant rape when I was in college, that was bad. It was 3 people. It lasted 6 hours. And I really thought they were going to murder me. And I still believe that I was at high risk of being killed. But I was able to disconnect emotionally and think about how to handle these men. What can I do to increase my odds of success? I knew I didn't have control, but I could have done things to make my odds worse or to make my odds better. And I was able to do things to make my odds better. But there was one part of it that I second guessed my decision for years about whether I could have gotten away at a certain point. And it's in the book. You'll understand in the book. And it ate at me. But when I went back to revisit it in writing the book, and I had done this in therapy too, but it was really the reminder that I needed to trust that Mary Beth in that moment, she was making the assessment of all the many, many factors that had to be considered in deciding whether to make that effort to get away. And I decided at the time that it was impossible. I wasn't going to be able to do it. And so I didn't try. But that didn't try ate at me. And so the book allowed me to again revisit it and other similar things and really remind myself about the strengths that I did have, the good choices that I did make, but also to be proud of what I did.
All right, there's a question. As a judge, did you help people without letting them know that you had substance issues and point them in the right direction while you were on the stand to help them better themselves?
Yeah, so I definitely did not come out as having a substance use disorder while I was working, not to the people who appeared before me. I actually, when I was a judge, joined the board for LifeRing, and I had to run that through the ethics people to get approval to do it like as an outside activity. That was the first time I had ever told an employer that I was in recovery, was when I filled out that outside activity form. And the chief judge in my office read it, and the chief judge in the whole region read it. And so it was really a little bit nerve-wracking to be disclosing that. But I didn't say that I was a meth addict. I just said that I had, I think, 24 years of sobriety at that point. And, here's what I'm going to do on the board for LifeRing. And I'm guessing they thought alcohol, but nobody ever asked, and I didn't tell them. But certainly the people that appeared before me, it would be inappropriate for me to disclose a personal piece of information like that. But I was an administrative law judge, and part of the law I had to apply did involve substance use disorder. And so for cases where the person appearing before me had a substance use disorder, there was certain questions I had to ask to get the information I needed to apply the law I was required to apply. So it wasn't my role to be able to make suggestions. And also, I don't know what's best for them as far as treatment, or, they're an individual. But certainly I did my best to be respectful and non-judgmental about their substance use disorder. I got the information that I needed. I didn't, go around or beat them up about it, or make unfounded inferences like they couldn't possibly be telling me the truth because they were struggling with their addiction or any of those things. I got what I needed to apply the law, and I moved on. But that was really my role when I was dealing with people who were appearing before me who had substance use disorders.
Well, I think what we forget too is judges see a lot of things. And if, sometimes when you've seen a lot, it's traumatic for you too, and you become jaded. Not that you did, but I'm just saying in general, sometimes we think judges aren't always empathetic, or, they have to follow the law, number one. That's their job. And they see a lot of things that most people don't see every day.
It's true, but I do think that judges could be better trained on substance use disorder. I think that they could be better trained as far as what it really is, about how difficult it can be to overcome, but also about what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that the person is incapable of telling the truth. It doesn't mean that the person couldn't be, that they can't also have a legitimate other issue. One of the things that appeared before me not infrequently was someone who had a mental health diagnosis, like let's say a psychotic in particular diagnosis, but they were also using meth sometimes. And so I had to try to disentangle what their symptoms were from the meth, or if they were sober from the meth, what symptoms would remain. And that was complicated. And they told us to do that, but we didn't always have the best training about how to do it, or the best guidance about how to do it. I mean, there was a way to do it. It's not that we didn't know how to do it, but people who don't understand substance use disorder sometimes the waters get muddy as far as how they look at it. I just think they could be better trained, and also better trained as far as how it is often a struggle, that the fact that someone had a relapse doesn't mean they weren't committed to their sobriety, or that they weren't trying, that we shouldn't make a negative inference as far as their motivation goes just because they were struggling with attaining abstinence. I don't think a lot of judges understand that concept.
Yeah. And there's a lot of self-medicating for, like you said, other mental health diagnoses. Bipolar is a big one, schizophrenia. And then there's substances that make those things worse. I mean, it's come out more and more that marijuana with psychosis is causing a lot of problems. And and it wasn't, it's now that it's stronger and medical grade, it's causing more and more. And that wasn't something that was publicized a lot back in the day or that people knew.
That's true. And also they weren't letting people do research on cannabis, right? And so how do you get data if you want to allow people to do research? Well, now they're doing some research and they're figuring out what actually are the consequences of long-term cannabis use. And that's information that people need so they can make an informed decision about whether they want to use it or how often they want to use it or all those things. But yeah, it was sort of anecdotal that some people were having psychotic symptoms from cannabis use, but for the majority of people, that's not true. And so I think a lot of people didn't accept that as being accurate, but it turns out that it is. I will say also, I had hallucinations from meth, but I wasn't one of those people that were highly paranoid on meth. But I did not realize that actually a significant proportion, I think it's around 15% of people who have long-term meth use struggle with psychotic symptoms for years after they get sober. And so that's I think a new understanding that can really be important in helping people in their recovery to address that mental health challenge. Even if they're sober, sometimes the psychotic symptoms don't completely go away, or they don't go away for a few years. And that's important information to help them manage the process.
Well, and I think too, there's a lot more information about like meth nowadays. It used to be that it was not so much a physical dependence. They thought that it was a mental dependence. And so if you just could mentally get off of it, but now they're realizing that it does tremendous damage long-term, and it is even harder for your brain to regulate than opiate use disorder.
It's a good point. I mean, I remember one time somebody told me I wasn't a real addict because I didn't have like withdrawals like you do from heroin or alcohol. And it's like, yeah, I'm sorry. Meth is an addictive substance. I don't know what you're trying to say to me, person. But it was we were sort of like, well, he's not as bad, because you don't have that the physical symptoms. I will say that one of my shocks in rehab was how bad alcohol is. I mean, I sort of thought in my mind, my meth use disorder mind, that alcohol was like a lighter weight drug. And then I went to rehab, and the women who had alcohol use disorder, they had some of the worst physical symptoms. They were having seizures. Their liver they were having a lot of problems. I mean, alcohol is a vicious drug on your body. And I think America underappreciates the severity of alcohol use disorder or the risk of using alcohol. I mean, there's a lot of data now coming out how even moderate drinking has increases your cancer risk for alcohol, all those other things. Sometimes in interviews, the interviewer wants me to say that pot is the entryway drug, and it's a terrible drug for that reason. And I point out that for me and many of my generation, alcohol was the first drug that we used, but also even though weed does have some physical impacts for long-term use that they're still figuring out. Alcohol is worse. I mean, if you're going to pick one for what's worse for your body between alcohol and cannabis, it's going to be alcohol. And I just think people don't assess the risk accurately as far as alcohol goes.
Well, there's only two that withdrawals can kill you, like two classifications: alcohol and benzos. Those are the two. So everything else, you might want to die from the withdrawals from opiates or, any of the other ones. But the only two that withdrawals can actually kill you that you really need to be in detox for are benzos and alcohol.
And I saw I'm getting tongue tied. I saw a statistic this past week that I believe it was men in the United States between ages, I believe it was 30 and 55. 1 out of every 5 deaths is attributed to alcohol.
Yeah, it's shocking. I mean, I will say one of the ideas that's more modern, because I've been around for 28 years now, is that substance use disorder is on a scale. Right now, we talk about severe or moderate or mild, and I think that's really helpful in thinking about alcohol. But also, I like the new idea how even if you don't check the box for a substance use disorder, that doesn't mean you might not be using the substance in a way that is not in your best interest. I mean, I think about with alcohol, and don't get me wrong, a lot of people use alcohol on a very limited basis. And I don't mean to imply like anti-alcohol Mary Beth, but the reality is that sometimes people use alcohol or cannabis or other drugs for things like conflict avoidance, handling feelings, when really you would be better off figuring out how to address the conflict or how to resolve your feelings or figure out what's going on. So you don't have to have a substance use disorder in order to be using a substance in a way that is actually not in your own best interest.
Yeah, and there's been so many groups that are like starting to band together to try to do that, like Sober Force, and which is cool because in the workplace, alcohol is everywhere. And so having these groups that are sober curious or, it's great. It's a great option so that if you don't feel like you don't have to feel the peer pressure to engage in those if you don't want to.
Yeah. And it's nice that more often they're having like real non-alcoholic drinks beyond just water and a Coke, some places like work events are having fancy non-alcoholic drinks. So you get to have something fun and walk around with a pretty glass and, be like everybody else. And so those kind of things, they're still not where hopefully they'll be in the future, but there's a movement forward in that. And that's really fabulous.
Oh, and the worst part is when you go to an event and cocktails are free, but you have to pay for non-alcoholic drinks. That's what gets me. Like, you're gonna make me pay $5.25 for my Diet Coke?
Yeah, true.
You would think that it would be the opposite because alcohol is more expensive, but no. Brett's back.
I'm back. Sorry, I had to take a quick restroom break. I finished my water.
I need to drink more water. That'll be one of my new goals that I'll attempt at some point. So
Less Diet Coke.
Yeah, less. I'm not gonna give it up completely yet, but I'll work that way eventually.
It's not forever.
So when does the book come out? Soon.
So, thank you. So again, the book is From Junkie to Judge, One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction. And it is available for pre-order now on Amazon and all the usual sites. If you're planning on buying it, please do pre-order it. There's reasons that helps me out. And then it will ship in January. So it will ship out the door. It ship as in the physical copy or the you can order the ebook, the Kindle or other ebook. And the audiobook is being created as we speak. And so you can't order it quite yet, but it will be available by January. But right now, the ebook and the hard copy paperback, the physical copy are available pre-order on Amazon and all the usual sites, shipping in January.
That's awesome. And I think it's a great thing to point out because we don't know this a lot of times that when you buy a book on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or whatever, if you leave a review, it really, really helps push the book forward when people see it. And so, if you appreciate that the person takes the time to write this book, really write them a review because it really does help.
That's true. Thank you for that.
Yeah. And the pre-orders help too because you have to have a certain amount to even be in the front of anything to be considered a bestseller of any category. And if you don't get there with the pre-sales, it's really hard later. So if you're interested in the book, really do pre-order and write a review when you read it.
Yes, thank you. That's exactly right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I can say it because I'm not writing the book, so it doesn't sound like I'm like.
Yes,
Not yet. Not yet, Ashley.
Yeah, somebody's gonna. When I write my book one day, somebody will have to say that for me.
That's right. I'll remember. I'll be happy to do it for you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for coming today. I love it. It's a different perspective, and we need to hear everyone's stories and all the different stories.
Well, I mean, I really appreciate the conversation and having a chance to talk to your audience. It's been great fun. I really do thank you very much.
Yeah, it was great, and I was having a conversation with another recovery podcast host the other day, and we were talking about what are some of the ways that we can break the stigma, and we were talking about having people that are professionals, not just professionals, but people that we perceive as being in these big fancy roles, and having people say I'm in recovery. And I think you're doing that by the book and by sharing your story and saying, look, I'm in recovery and I was a judge. Like that's huge.
Yes, and that it really is one of the reasons I decided to do it. I just feel, I want to be as open as I can about it, and to say, I mean, part of it is sometimes people think that people with an IV meth addiction can't get well. There's this societal belief like those people are hopeless. It's too late for them. And I really do want to be part of saying, no, it's not, not too late for them, because I was that person. And then, once I got sober, I was able to accomplish many things professionally and even more important, personally. So let's don't give up on anyone. Everyone has, can recover. I don't care how bad their substance use disorder is. I don't care how they consume their drug or what drug they consume. They are worthy of our efforts to try to help them get well.
It's so much cheaper to help somebody get well and then them contribute to society than to give up and just allow it to continue. We want people to get better. Well, thank you again for coming. I'm so glad you came. And if anyone that is watching, there's hope. There's always hope.
Always. Awesome. Let's close out the show.
Yes, I can eat dinner.
Yeah, me too. She does. Ashley does love her books. It's true.
I'm a reader.
It is true. Ashley loves the books. All right. Well, thank you to everyone that tuned in tonight, and to the people that are watching this after the live has ended. Thank you so much. If you guys are watching us on YouTube, please be sure to subscribe to the page and turn on notifications so that you know when we go live, which if you guys haven't figured it out just yet, it's every Thursday night, 7 Central. Was that 8 Eastern? I'm terrible with time zones, and my wife's always giving me a hard time because I should know this. That is 8 Eastern.
Yes.
Oh.
8 Eastern, 7 Central,
and
6 Mountain.
The worst part is, like, I can picture the United States, like the map in my head, and think about where all the different things are. But then when I'm on the spot, I can't think about it. Is that forward, backwards? I struggle with the math portion of that. So I should write it down. I really should. But yeah, thank you to everybody that tuned in tonight. We'll be back again next Thursday night, bringing you guys some more hope and inspiration and helping spread the message that you're not alone and that we do recover. So thank you for everybody that tuned in tonight. Thank you, Mary Beth, for sharing your story. It was incredible, and I'm so grateful that you were willing to come on and share with us. Excited about the book that's coming out. Be sure to pre-order that book. And like Ashley said, leave a review. That's so important. Cannot emphasize that enough. So thank you guys. And remember, progress, not perfection. See you guys next week.